Here this week for the interview is Cheney. Chey is a middle school teacher from Toronto, Ontario. Chey is also a coach and also works with students around leadership work as well. He is a passionate ELA teacher and is very much an advocate of his teaching philosophy centering around student agency, student voice, and also a commitment to social justice. Along with his former teaching partner, Pav Wander, Chey co-hosts the Chey and Pav Show, as well as a live educational music radio show on Voice Ed Radio called The Drive. Basically, Chey never sleeps. Chey, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Tom, thank you very much. Glad to be here. The secret to not sleeping is 3 scoops of pre-workout with every meal, and then you find you have an abundance of energy. Possibly not that healthy, but I'm up all the time.
You work incredibly hard, and you, along with Pav, are really creating a lot of energy around some topics. You have some authentic conversation. I love that. It's great to finally have you here. You and I have just gotten to know each other over the last year or so, and I've been familiar with your work, of course, through what used to be called the Staff Room Podcast, now the Chey and Pav Show. But and I'm a subscriber to that podcast and listen to it. But I'm really glad to have you here and have a chance to chat with you, because I do appreciate a lot of the reflections that you share on your show. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Let's start though with your journey. Now you've been in education for 20 plus years, and you've taught at the same school. So this will be an interesting. I've asked this question of other guests, but before we dig into some of the substance of the conversation, maybe highlight for us. Often I ask people, the 20-year journey, what does the resume look like? But you've been in the same school for 20 years. So maybe talk about your journey teaching in the same school and how maybe you have evolved as an educator over the arc of your career.
Well, Tom, first, I'm glad you didn't ask me to point out my resume first and foremost, because the conversation would have gone down really quickly. So I really appreciate that save. You know what? That conversation of 20 years, because in a smaller context of answering this question, I remember early on, there was always this push, don't stay in your school too long, move on, move on, move on. But I think it's certainly in our board that the evolution of teaching or education has changed, that the school changes every time a new administration comes in. Despite mandates and regulations, everyone brings in their own style of administration, their own style of leadership, and what is their focus and what is their vision. And so I've always argued that I've had plenty of different experiences based on all the different administrators that have walked into the space. Some loving what I'm doing, maybe others not loving what I'm doing, and then even on a disconnect of our relationship, just what they wanted to do from the school. So I always think a school evolves every time a new administration steps into the space. So although I've been in the same community for 20 years, I don't necessarily feel that it's all one linear progression, that the school's always been evolving in the same path. It's always gone off in different tangents. And sometimes it's fun to look back and say, we have this program in our school. I remember when this administrator brought this in 17 years ago. I remember when this administrator, this leadership wanted to do this. I remember when we made this SIP team and we decided to focus on these issues. So 20 years, I think, allows me insight to really see how a school evolves and how that evolve can be all over the place, and then how we try to make it some linear progress at the end, but realize there was nothing linear about it at all. It always comes and goes in a whim. If I think about my journey of 20 years of teaching, I like to think of myself as the teacher that wasn't ever expecting or thinking about teaching. I didn't get into teaching as a desire myself. I was good with coaching and working with youth, and I was working at camp counselors. And it was actually a boss that said, you know what, you've been doing this camp counselor, summer camp stuff too long. You're 25 years old. We need to use this skill set, and we need to elevate you. So they guided me and pushed me into the teaching profession because they saw a skill set that I didn't totally recognize in myself. And I think a lot of times people's narrative is, I did this myself. I did this myself. And I think I'm very aware that I didn't do this myself. People around me saw skills in me that I didn't totally pick up on or made the connection of what this would be good for. And so I got a lot of support and guidance to jump into teaching. And so I went into teaching a little raw or a little naive as to what teaching would be like, but I had a lot of passion, and I had lots of successes coaching and building teams and running summer camps. And I used that to dive into teaching. And then through 20 years, lots of trials, lots of errors. But the theme of who helped, who supported, always aware that there's always people around me that explicitly or maybe sort of behind the scenes have helped guide me and support me and get me to this position now, which is, someone that didn't necessarily ponder or consider themselves a teacher, but people around me pushed me, guided me, supported me, and put me in a space where I was able to sort of learn on the fly, build and create capacity. And now 20 years later, 20 plus years later, still really excited about growing myself as a teacher to be better in the classroom space. And I think what hasn't changed in that 20 years is my desire to always want to be better and to learn from the people around me and to have the utmost respect and gratitude for everyone around me that helps me, whether I directly see that help or not. I know that those supports are in place.
Yeah. So how have you, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer because I want to try to separate experience. So when we say, how are you different than you were 20 years ago? Obviously, you're more experienced. And when you're more experienced, the job just becomes, I suppose, a little more seamless and you have a much greater perspective. But if you could try to separate out the experience and maybe just talk about how are you different maybe in your mindset as an educator, look at your first 5 years versus the last 5 years or something like that. How have you, what sort of change do you notice in yourself in terms of your perspective as a teacher?
Well, this one for me is an easy one. I was very good at compliance teaching. I used to be able to show off that, I can make a class line up by a snap of the finger. Now, I wouldn't even suggest that's good methodologies or pedagogy, but early on in my career, this is what I could do. And then being a youthful sort of athletic male, I played into the cool factor. And I always think of it, it's like only Nixon can go to China. 20 years later, I decenter myself as much as I can. I downplay my personality as much as I can. I ultimately want kids to come and want to be in the space that's created, not because of the teacher they have. And early on in my career, very much centered on my personality as the driving force for the learning, and could use that coolness to leverage compliance because people wanted to comply because I was the cool teacher. And now I won't even use the vernacular cool. I've completely dropped it because that's not a culture I want to manifest because it's completely exclusive and not inclusive. So when I think about 5 years, I would almost, I'll put on a Blue Jays hat or something instead of my Yankees hat because I'm just like, what I thought was great teaching, what I thought was really impactful, it hasn't stood the test of time. Where now I'm in a place with the way I'm teaching, whether it works or not, I truly believe that the pedagogies and the methodologies and centering student lived experiences and trying to decenter myself and make the classroom the star, not a teacher, not an individual, not cult of the individual, has certainly been the biggest shift. So I relied on what I would argue trivial things early on that I was able to get away with, which is probably also why it took a little bit of time to move away from that. I got away with things that I know other teachers wouldn't have been gifted the opportunity to get away with. And so there's been a great journey for myself to center the work, center the curriculum. Like I would probably have bashed the curriculum. I don't need the curriculum. Where now, when they talk about, we need to build relationships. Yeah, I got that figured out. But I want to use the curriculum to build relationships. I want the learning activities. I want an assessment piece to help foster a positive relationship. And then also realize that building a relationship isn't about me. I don't decide when and how to build a relationship with a student. Students gift me whatever they want to gift me in a relationship. And these are thoughts I wouldn't have thought of 5 years ago. Just too much ego, although I'm not against ego because I've watched a lot of Captain Kirk and Star Trek. You control your ego, it can manifest into great things. But early on, very ego driven and very much centered myself and thought my coolness and my personality was enough to drive great learning. And later on, no, I drop as much of that as I can.
Yeah, and you would have had a lot of success with that because you do. I mean this. You have an alluring personality, engaging personality, and I can see where as a young teacher that might be very reinforcing to kind of say, "Hey, this is working for me," but it's working maybe for the wrong reasons. And so you could still bring that personality to the job and yet be, but be, as you say, decentered, which is interesting to use that term or that concept because you work in a very diverse school. Is that true? That's true, right?
This is true. Yes.
So tell us about your school.
The school, the community is Rexdale in Toronto, exceptionally diverse, not binary diverse, like truly exceptionally diverse. You can't pick one ethnicity or one race or one religion that dominates the space in terms of numerical numbers. It's really diverse, and so is the staff. And so as a white male coming from Ottawa, this was new to me. This was part of my naivety, totally unaware of the privileges I have and what I could get away with. and what I was afforded and gifted. And so when I think of my teaching, that 20-year curve, it's a lot of learning as a teacher, but it's also learning a lot about life, realizing how sheltered you were, realizing when you come into this space, you have a lot to learn. I think back of religious symbols or cultural artifacts that students were bringing to school that I would have trivialized or certainly wouldn't have honored. And and realize now just how much my culture dominates the space. So again, it becomes about decentering whiteness, because in this community, the community I teach, it's not the narrative. It's not the narrative that's in place. And so it's a lot of personal learning, a lot of personal growth. So when you introduce me as sort of keen on social justice, I would never position myself as a social justice advocate. There's other folks that have been doing the work, having the receipts, having the lived experience. I understand when I position my role in it, I'm a white male teaching in a completely racialized community, and comes the moral and ethical responsibility to be aware of their needs, their lived experiences, and adapt to it and support it and honor it and elevate that voice, and be an ally, be an advocate, be a co-disruptor with them, knowing when my privilege gives me a space to speak up, and then also knowing when my privilege hinders their voice from speaking up, and how can I support from the side, and when do I have to, push from behind. And so it's been great learning as a human being to be in this space, because Tom, sometimes when I dive into other conversations, this is my normal. Sometimes when I jump into other schools, talk to other teachers, see their backgrounds, their profiles, I realize other teachers, they're not gifted this type of experience. And when you think about social justice work under the umbrella of anti-racist education, we all have foundational principles we believe in and want to attest to. But how does that look in your space? And so it's really important for me to be really open about positioning myself, white male, middle school, completely racialized students, and a very diverse staff. And so how do I negotiate that space to be part of the social justice solution, where if that dynamic is different, then how does it look? There's immediate pushback if I am culturally insensitive, because everyone around me can put me in my place, and rightfully so do it. And then I wonder, what if you're a social justice advocate, but you're dealing with an entirely white community? Like, what is the pushback? Where are the challenges? I'm not saying there aren't any, they're different. So how do you negotiate them? And so to come back to that point about social justice, I feel very passionate about it, because I feel very aware of my role and my dynamic in the space, but I would never try to elevate myself and say that I'm a social justice advocate. There's other folks that have done the work and the important work far greater, and I'm learning from them. And I hope one day maybe someone would say I'm a social justice warrior or I'm a disruptor, but I would never anoint myself that title of I'm a disruptor, because I haven't done the work. I don't have the receipts, not in comparison to the folks that live this every single day. And even with the best interest, I'm still a white male. I can always disconnect. I have the privilege of being able to disconnect from social justice work if I wanted. Not that I want to, but I'm aware that I can. And there's folks that are in the social justice movement that they don't ever get to disconnect. They're always having to be plugged in and having the emotional burden to stay plugged in, because someone will challenge them or question them if they don't. And so passionate about social justice, but I'm not putting myself on the top of any hierarchy as being a social justice advocate. Just really aware, really working hard, and hoping that I'm making a small little impact somewhere on the bigger scope of change in anti-racist education.
Such an interesting experience. I mean, you look at Canada, and Canada is 70 to 75% white. So we often, as two white males, we don't find ourselves in the position of minority very often. And so you are in this situation, which I think you've mentioned this a couple of times, learning how to navigate through this scenario. So if you were to give your younger self some advice on how to navigate this situation in a way that you think honors the diversity of the school, what advice would you give? Or if there's a teacher out there who finds themselves in this situation and they're trying to say, like, how do I do the right work? How do I to be that ally? How do I be that advocate? How do I decenter myself? What's sort of the advice or lessons that you've learned from that situation specifically?
Well, Tom, you said the key word there is decenter yourself. As I've always said, that before I think I'm going to disrupt anything else, you better disrupt yourself first. And I'm still actively disrupting myself, which becomes like when I talk about dropping vernacular like cool, or I drop vernacular like they're my students. As a white male in a racialized community, I don't refer to them as my students. I find this is vernacular that needed disruption. The students, the class, our learners, collective growth. It's about in my case, the only advice I can give in one essence is, if you are teachers relying on your personality, I relied on my whiteness to I don't even want to say control, but maybe it was just control, to creating the culture of the classroom space. And it became about using the tools and methodologies of great education to foster great relationships. Because, of course, relationships is the key to culturally responsive pedagogy, building a quality relationship with your students over time, building trust, understanding that your work you're doing is moving forward, but you're not going to get it right away. You have to make a commitment to your students that you're trying to get it right all the time. Even something like calling class boys or girls. I would have said ladies and gentlemen years and years ago, but now I've understood that need to disrupt that. So I coach myself in front of my kids, students, class. I'm going to stop dropping this vernacular, make sure I'm saying folks all the time. And it becomes that co-learning space. So you have to build that trust, and you have to be aware to not contest that I'm building a safe space. One of the things I've learned is that I'm in no position to establish anything's a safe space. I'm the teacher. I'm the white male teacher. Everything is always safe for me. And how am I leveraging students that maybe don't feel safe by telling them, hey, this is a safe space? I actually just further alienate them. It reminds me going to a staff meeting when administrators say, this is a safe space to talk. No, it's not for every teacher. And when you put that pressure on teachers that it's a safe space, you just further alienate. And so I would give back to the question. Don't worry, I'm not rambling too much. Is don't assume you've created a safe space despite your personality. Make sure you're really fostering deep relationships through your content. Create content that's meaningful, connecting to them. Read alouds where it's a story that reflects them, that they've had a choice, they've had a voice in saying. Using music per se. When I was writing a biography, I used to always start to tell me a biography about you. So boring. And I've manifested that because in our school and with middle schoolers, music is such a passion for them. They've always got a TikTok playing or music playing or a song, or they're humming or they're talking about. I said, let's use music. Let's use lyrics to tell your story. And what I was gifted from students, from what they're going through an assignment, through a task, through curriculum, through writing, was far greater than me doing get to know you activities at the beginning of the year, where I leveraged on them. I learned this from Rukia Mohammed, who's a great teaching coach in TDSB, that we talk about relationships all the time, but we force students to make a relationship with us. How, you know what? Our students are smart. Every single year they know, oh, my teacher's going to make a relationship with me in 2 weeks. And we are disingenuous in understanding how much pressure we're putting on students all the time to make a relationship for us, not necessarily for them. And so relationship building is key, but it's complex and it's layered. And it is, Tom, a word I got from you in a conversation we had earlier on assessment, it's nuanced. There's no definitive statement on how to make a relationship. It takes time. And as a teacher, you have to be comfortable that not every student wants or needs or is looking for a relationship with you. I can think of one anecdote, and sorry, you can cut me off at any time, where a certain student was put in my room because they said, oh, he needs that male role model. And I said, well, okay. But I knew enough about the student to know that he had 2 older brothers. And so we had a really curt conversation. I said, and an open conversation, and you can have this with middle schoolers. And I said, you know what? I know you've been placed in my room because everyone thinks I'm going to be a male role model for you. But I said, I'm not sure you're looking for that from me. And I said, and we're going to have a relationship, and it may be good and it may be positive. But I said, when we talk about this dynamic, I'm not coming here to be your savior. I think I'm being positioned to be your savior. And earlier on, I would have jumped on that mantle and wore it like a cape. But now I'm much more mindful of, I don't want to be, and I can't be a savior. That's not the rightful role in social justice. So I think of that dynamic where earlier on I would have jumped in to be the savior, and that would have been sort of my early movement towards social justice, centering myself in the great work I thought I was doing. And so when I think of that advice, decenter yourself, work hard to build relationships, be mindful of what you're leveraging. And so this idea of safe space, or you deciding when a relationship is built, they're not for you to decide. And you have to be comfortable that not everyone will deem you to be the creator of a safe space or deem you as the teacher that they want to have that positive relationship with. And then be comfortable that not every student is looking to have a really meaningful relationship with their teacher, a productive one in which we still learn and we still grow together. But just be mindful that every student comes to school with different lived experiences and wanting something different from that school. And it's not just centering yourself and saying everyone's going to like me, and because everyone likes me, we're going to have a safe space and get along. And because of that, we'll learn. Far more complex than that. embrace the complexity. There, edit out all the rest and just end with that.
No, I often think about when you have to declare something, it probably isn't so. So if you, like, a safe space emerges and evolves and happens organically, if you have to declare it, it probably isn't truly a safe space for everybody. As you say, if a principal needs to say it, if a teacher needs to declare it, we probably aren't there yet. It's not that it's an unsafe environment, but I think you're onto something there. I also want to pivot now to, and I also appreciate you confirming my assertion at the beginning that you are a deep reflective thinker, because that was really fantastic. But I want to pivot to professional learning here, Chey.
I thought we were going to play catch. Okay, sorry, got it.
I know both from getting to know you personally, but also from the podcast and your show, that you are a deep thinker about many topics. And one of them, of course, is professional learning, this concept of self-driven PD and the idea that teachers take ownership over their professional growth. So what for you is the ideal kind of model? Like, how do you think we find the sweet spot between the needs of the collective? So we've got school goals and the school's working toward achieving those goals. But then there's also your own professional curiosity that has to be nurtured in order for you to feel fulfilled as a teacher. So how do you find the balance in that? What for you is the ideal model for professional learning?
Now, for me, 20 years in, the ideal model has become self-driven. I'm in. Like, we always talk about self-actualization, and then you wonder, how well can you really know yourself? Human beings are complex. It's tough for you to know someone else when we barely understand ourselves. But I think I have enough of a grasp of who I am to know where I want to improve upon. So I can take that sort of mantle of where I want to direct my PD. But could I have 10 years ago? Certainly not. So I don't want to make definitive statements. This is the sweet spot for everyone, because, of course, despite teaching and education being a team journey, it also is a very isolating and personalized experience. And so you want to tap into that. When I think about PD, I often used to joke that, when we had a coach come in or we had a special PD come in, we're just going to review the latest article on Edutopia. And so I could get ahead of it by just reading the blog or reading the post. And it's erroneous for me to laugh it off, because maybe in that particular moment I didn't need that, but that's not for me to decide who needs what. And so when I think of the journey now, I love to be able to drive my own PD, and I would love to articulate this is what everyone should do. But is it valued? Is it honored? Does it get a little frustrating? I'll talk specifically on sort of self-driven PD. Pav and I have committed a lot of time to our own personal growth. Do we see impacts in the classroom? Immediately. So if someone says, well, why do you podcast? Yeah, it's not for the likes and the money. It's because in the classroom, I know I have something new. I know I'm refining my craft. I know I'm engaging in the truthful act of reflection and turning it into action, and then having the action research right in front of me, students that gift me the data on whether what I'm doing or trying to do is actually working. And that is of immense growth, and I love that. But it can also be a little frustrating when you're taking on the journey of professional development on your own, because I think a lot of vernacular drops. Oh, teachers can do this, teachers can do that. But how much burden should I shoulder, or how much toxic productivity am I putting on other people by saying, hey, I'm doing all this learning on my own, you should do the same, you'll see growth. You know what? Pav and I have decided to invest hours and hours of extra a week. And I don't want to get caught telling people they have to do that also. This has just been something that's given Pav and I great joy and growth. And so on that level, you have to decide, what's important for you. Does it give you joy to do these type of things? I think Tim Cavey talked about this recently on one of his blogs, or one of his podcasts, talked about this idea of, wellness, blocking everything out for the weekend. But he actually talked about finding joy, staying connected to his work through the weekend. So we don't want to trivialize what people need on that front. So back to that self-driven PD, I love it. I think this is the best place for me to keep going. But I also aware it's not necessarily for everyone. It could be perceived as toxic to other people to go forth. And then I would also share there's some frustration with it too, because despite everything being a journey of self-actualization, we do like appreciation. We do like thank yous. We do like acknowledgments for the work. And one thing Pav and I could probably attest to is the appreciation for the work you do is not there. So when you're doing that self-driven PD, you really do have to connect. You're doing it for yourself and your students, because you won't get the support or the acknowledgement that maybe you're looking for. And even if you're not looking for, we all know how much a little acknowledgement just elevates you a little further. So it's a very isolating journey to take PD on your own. So Tom, back to your point, does there need to be a shared piece? I do believe there needs to be a shared piece. Our school has done great efforts to try to make shared and a variety of different options. So we have a book study. So we're studying books in the morning. Then you have that's sort of your informal PD. And then we have our PD where we're focusing on, as a school, let's build a guided reading program, and let's talk to teachers from middle school to junior to primary to see how we can make this work and how we can have these shared conversations. And so, is there a sweet spot? I am sure there is a bliss spot. Have I found it? I'm probably not the best gauge of that, because I've gone to the outlier. I've gone hardcore on personalized development and seen great successes, but I wouldn't attest that you have to do it that way. Finding that sweet spot, it's a personalized journey. And I also, based on your lived experiences and your teaching experience, what is going to benefit you the most. And you have to try to find that yourself. And we don't want to trivialize how tough it is to actually know who you are. I remember reading a quote said, treat others how you want to be treated. Do we all actually know how we want to be treated? Do we know what pushes us forward? I often hear the vernacular, take a risk. I'm not trying to make my students take risks. I don't learn through risk taking. I learn through inspiration. Inspire me with great content. I'm going to learn. Tell me I've got to risk something to learn. And, I sort of shut down a little bit. But that's a personal journey for me. So when I think about treat others the way to be treated, I often don't use vernacular, let's take risks, because I don't learn through risks. I learn through inspiration. So treat others the way you want to be treated reminds me of this whole journey of self-actualization, and how much do we really know ourselves, and how much does that dictate how we move forward?
Yeah. I really appreciate that answer, because I think sometimes just finding your way and finding the balance is a really important approach. I think the words always and never get us in trouble in education or in a lot of fields, right? You should always do self-directed PD. You should never do sit and get, like, there are times where you're learning about something and you're brand new at it, and it's good to listen to an expert tell you about it, and then find your way through your self growth and all of those things. And I think being able to discover who you are, what you need as a professional, and understanding the balance between, here as a school, we are working toward this goal, this literacy program, or trying to raise, the reading levels, or we're trying to intervene here, we're trying to look at behavioral support, whatever we're doing, we have a collective goal, but also being able to balance that with the personal and your own curiosity and your own journey. I think sometimes we talk in extremes, and I think social media has magnified that in terms of the hyperbole, but a lot of times it's, as you use the word, and I've used it too many times, is the idea of nuance. There's nuance to our professional growth, and I think there's a place for all of it. And when you find that balance between all of it, I think we're in a really good spot. I want to finish up with, I had Pav on the podcast in November, and we talked a little bit about the sort of the foundation of the podcast, what motivated you, and the connection that the two of you have. That your show is quite high profile. The two of you are quite high profile, and because you also do the radio show on Voice Ed Radio, presenting workshops, so you would be seen as fairly high profile in education. So I wonder, as an active practitioner, as someone who is actively full-time job teaching and working, you're putting yourself out there. Maybe I'm asking this question inartfully, but you put yourself out there. What is that like for you as a teacher working in a school, but also carving out this niche, this profile for yourself? I know that it's not ego driven, but you're still creating a profile for yourself and putting yourself out there as an active practitioner. What are some of the upsides and downsides of that? Talk, because there may be listeners out there right now thinking to themselves, I'd like to maybe push myself to create a profile or create a following or try to do something, like a podcast or something organic. What is that like for you, both positively and negatively? What are the upsides and downsides?
Well, first, it was a wise decision to have Pav on. That would have been my first round draft choice as well. As I often joke that I am the consequence of you befriending Pav. If you're going to be Pav's friend, by default, I have to be your friend. So I appreciate this invite, but I understand that if I were drafting, I would have picked Pav as the number one draft choice. And it's like, well, who's left to draft? So this is the dynamic, and I love it. And of course, all tongue in cheek, Tom. All tongue in cheek.
Of course.
When I think of our journey, I think of being active practitioners, and it comes to earlier on, I would have been okay with a term like, oh, we're educators. And I've come to realize, well, what do you mean by we're educators? It's a good starting point, but what does this mean? What are we leveraging, or what are we trying to mask by this? I think about, as a teacher, I always want to position myself. What is my position? So I speak openly about being a white male in a racialized community, not because I'm better, because it identifies what my experiences are going to be. What am I seeing? And it also identifies what I might not be seeing. I cannot tell you what it's like to be a grade 2 teacher teaching in an all-white community. So I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to know the nuances of it because I don't know it. And sometimes I think of this term when we think about educator, are we just leveraging a title so that we can talk with confidence and position ourselves as an expert on anything and everything education? And so Pav and I have really carved out this narrative that we are just 2 teachers. And we say just because we don't want to center ourselves as superheroes. When I think about a student's growth, it's great to have that one impactful moment where that student gravitates to you. But Pav and I are very comfortable and very confident, especially as grade 8 teachers. And Pav's she's a grade 8 teacher this year. She fluctuates a little bit with her assignments. But when you're doing graduation, there's often a lot of fixation on the grade 8 teacher. But I've always attested, no, I'm not their graduating teacher. I'm one teacher that they've had from K through 8, and custodians and principals and office staff and lunch supervisors. This is a manifestation. I'm just a representation at graduation of all the teachers that have done great work all the way through. And so this just 2 teachers is something we attach ourselves to because we want to honor the fact that a student's growth, we will all have those one anecdotal stories, those one individual stories, but collectively it's about, I, as a grade 8 teacher, have the utmost confidence that my grade 7 teacher has done wonderful things with those students. And so is the grade 6 teacher. And so is the grade 5 teacher. I'm not trying to catch aha moments saying, oh, you haven't ever done this in teaching. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build upon what every other teacher has laid in this foundation of students' growth. And so coming back to who we are and back to my comment about educators, Pav and I are very clear about where we are in teaching, not because it puts us in a better space, but it makes it obvious what we represent. And what Pav and I always think we represent is sort of like, as we've had a few teachers talk about, we're an easy access point to talking about all things teaching that can then direct you into other spaces to learn and to grow. So when we think about our content, we're open about being active practitioners, teachers. And in the space of education, there's value in learning. This is action research. We're providing, I don't want to say we're providing, but I guess if you looked at our content, this is a window into what's going on in a middle school classroom. So with our podcast and with our social media, it's not just definitive, grand statements, although we make those and I like making those, and Pav edits them for me so they sound really smart. But we also make sure, it comes calculated. So we make sure we post classwork every day. There's something we're working on in the class so people can see that this is what we're doing. And you know what? Sometimes it's just a chart paper with markers on it. It's not necessarily the greatest thing going on in Jamboard that week. This was just a chart paper activity we did, but you can see the conversations that was going on in the classroom. And then we try to have, our content, and we try to have sort of our statements, our philosophies on teaching, and it manifests, but it opens up to, we're 2 teachers. This is what teachers are thinking. This is what teachers are doing. And it's not necessarily right, but it's open. And so Pav and I have, been celebrated and had some, you want to call it pushback or calling out, which is great because we learned through it. But what we think we curate in this space is a brave space to engage in teacher dialogue. And our podcast never claims to be the definitive answer. It always sort of attests to, this is a space for conversation in which we can all go off and gather some more information. And our insights, they're anecdotal, but we don't not research our podcast episodes. We read articles, we read blogs, we try to connect those all, but we always end with the idea that we're open for conversation. So our podcast episodes often get blog responses that we highlight because we're not telling you what's going on. We're just sharing you what's going on in our space. How are you connecting with what we're talking about? Where do you see a different perspective? How can we continue to collectively grow? And so we often think of our podcast and our content as just that. It's a access point to what's going on in the classroom. It's a gateway to easy access to lots of rich talking points. And we always think our podcast and content complements something. Tom, so I'll use yours as an example. We'll talk about assessment one day, but Pav and I aren't assessment experts. What we're expert in is trying to use a variety of different assessments and telling you what was working and not working. And then maybe that will push you to, your content that tends to be more assessment-driven, assessment expertise that Pav and I can't offer, but it complements. So you can listen to the action research, and then you dive into the content expert to sort of bridge the two. So we always joke that our podcast is not a must-listen to episode. The content you find there, you could find anywhere. But we would also make that argument of anyone's content. When we talk about gatekeeping, as soon as you say you have a must listen to episode, I for sure am not going to listen to it. When we talk about our absolutes, again, tongue in cheek. But this idea of not being a gatekeeper of information, I think is something Pav and I really attest to. And then we've been gifted people that have been very responsive to it because they do feel it is a different type of learning space. We want to learn from our peers, as you said earlier, Tom, and then other times we know we want to learn from an expert. We want to dive into a research text. We want to just read a blog. We want to listen to a podcast. We feel in the grand scope of sort of educational learning, our content can be for you on a personal journey. We've had districts that have come in and used certain episodes to do PD on their staff. But ultimately, we feel our content is a window into teaching. It's an access point into everything that matters to teachers. We hope we touch on everything that matters to teachers. And then it inspires you to go and find additional information, additional learning elsewhere to sort of piece it together and weave it together for that great growth. And Pav and I have been lucky to have a little bit of success. I mean, it's always a little humbling to say you have got a profile. I think Pav and I's profile, I think it's accessible. It's middle school teachers, it's male, female, it's racialized white. It gives you a little bit of dynamic. It's talking about a racialized community and experiences. And I think that is just a space where people want to come in and want to hear and learn about and engage with and share their ideas. So we don't think we have the PTI of educational podcasts, but we feel we have a nice little space that engages our audience and is a access point to go off into other spaces. And it really goes under the category of it's a collective growth space.
Yeah. Love that. Interesting lens through which to examine the word just when you mentioned earlier, that you're just teachers, because so often we talk about the opposite of teachers not using that phrase, we're just teachers, but an interesting lens through which to examine the use of that word. Listeners, PTI stands for those of you who aren't sports fans, Pardon the Interruption is a sports debate show between Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon. It's been on for years, and certainly they get into heated debate, but the authenticity of the conversations on your show. Chey, very quickly, how do you handle criticism? I want you, if there's listeners out there thinking, hey, I'd like to start a podcast, or I'd like to start putting myself out there more. I know you've been criticized both inside your school community, but also outside. So just very quickly, some advice for people. How do you handle the criticism that inevitably comes your way whenever you try to put yourself out there? What's the best way to navigate through that?
I probably haven't mastered that.
No one has. I don't think any of us have mastered that. But what is some of the ways that you can now, give some advice to people who are thinking about putting themselves out there?
Have your very close circle. So Pav and I are lucky enough that we do the podcast together. And although we have a few interviews, it's predominantly a PTI style show. It's Pav and I sharing our and having some debate, is to rely on each other and be aware that criticism will come, attacks will come. I think recently we got called radicals. And you just sort of first it gets you. It does get you in the stomach. It gets you all fired up. And you have to have that person, or maybe it's a few people that you can comfortably debrief with, calm yourself down with. And then also, do have those conversations. When you talk about who are your friends are people you can have conversations with that maybe don't just elevate you, to say, well, maybe we didn't say this right. Maybe we weren't trying to articulate that. Maybe this isn't great practice. And you have to be open to calmly debriefing. And it comes back to a comment I made earlier on, disrupting yourself. And then also You you hear the vernacular all the time. You have to have thick skin. You do sort of have to have a little bit of thick skin. You have to decide and be mindful, who is it that's is providing this criticism of you? Are they someone that's in your space? Are they someone that's in your circle? Are they someone that's connected to your content? Are they people that come by frequently? Are they a troll account? Something like that. You have to pause and just look at who's providing this criticism of you, and then just weigh it against who's providing the support, and who sort of support and admiration propels you in the long run. We always say, as I said already in this episode, it's about doing it for yourself. But if it's in a silo and it's silent, it is tough to keep yourself motivated. You can get a little down on that. You do need the validation. Maybe need is the wrong word, but it certainly elevates you to get a little bit of validation, a little bit of affirmation, and Pav and I hold on to those moments when so-and-so reaches out with a compliment. So you've got to be able to balance or flow, take more worth or more stock in the praise from those that you want praise from or need praise from. Again, these might be the wrong vernacular of want or need, but we all know the value of praise. And when it comes from certain voices, like when an administrator praises your work or an administrator shares your work, that means something. When a teacher comes up to you in the hallway and says, "I listened to your episode, that really connected with me," that means something. Even if they just say, "I listened to your episode," whether they agreed with it or not, that means something. And then just trying to be aware of who it is that is giving you sort of criticism or pushback, and try to understand their perspective, and then try to be appreciative of where they're coming from. And then you'll probably realize a lot of folks, this is what they do. This is what brings them joy in the social media space, is trying to crush people. I think Pav and I have joked about this before, that probably the 4 or 5 folks that went after us the most early on, 3 years later, one, if they're even still in the social media space, they're still just doing the same thing. And it reminds me of, often we joke about, or we don't joke about, we talk about, you know who your supporters are when times are tough, but you also know who your supporters are when times are good. Who's going to celebrate your accomplishments with you? Who's going to champion what you're doing with you? And it reminds me of some of these. No need for names, but when we're off camera, I'll drop all the names. But some of those folks, 3 or 4 years later, that Pav and I have been in this experience, they still do the same things. You can just see them floating around. And I make that comment because Pav and I look back and say, 3 years ago, we didn't tweet the same way. We didn't use Instagram the same way. Our podcast content wasn't the same. We were doing more presentations. We would say we're a little bit more responsive. We've seen our growth. I said, but we're growing. And the folks that were causing us grief 3 years ago are still spinning, I would argue, spinning in the same game. And ultimately, when it comes to social media as a space to grow, are you growing? And what are you getting out of it that's making you a better teacher? So in sort of the hindsight of being able to look at the people that gave us a big pushback, we know we had a few that were, I wouldn't say after us, it's too strong a word, but we're pushing back a lot of our content early on. They're nowhere now, but they're still doing the same games with other people. And you just want to say, this tends to be the nature of the beast. Find value in the work you're doing. Find those people that are close to you that you can sort of debrief. And as I often joke, if there's nothing going on, I'll turn on my inner Michael Jordan and I will manifest a problem just to propel me further.
Right. I like that. You remind me of an expression that I often try to follow as best as possible, which is, if you wouldn't go to that person for advice, then don't give their criticism a second thought. In terms of their comments or their take on that. It's tough. Anybody that says that other people's opinions don't matter is probably not telling the truth. We've just all sort of learned to cope, handle, process, compartmentalize. The thick skin is true. We have to develop that for sure. Okay, 2 questions as we finish up. These are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, Chey. Here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction that you want to go. But the question is, educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Now, on my Selfdriven PD, Pav and I keep ourselves up at night, often thinking about what we have to accomplish. Are we taking on too much? Focusing on the goals. So, sure, we have our podcast. We've tried to develop some more writing. We're working on a few writing projects. We're doing a lot more presentations. These have been opportunities gifted to us through the podcast, but it does cause stress. And even when you're not working on those projects, you're always thinking about those projects. And it becomes tough to just unwind, because even when you're unwinding, you're still thinking, oh, I got to try and sneak in 2 hours tonight of editing. I got to sneak in, 2 hours of doing some writing here. So it's taxing on that front. Now, when it comes to the professionals, well, that is the professional. When it comes to the teaching side, one, you could argue, well, can you dedicate all your time to your teaching when you're dedicating your time to this? Well, I would argue that time manifests in the classroom. So I can make, it's an investment in my teaching. But as teaching, like, what do I worry about the most? Sometimes I worry about sort of the mundane things that do tend to slow us down, although they have value. So you're writing your report cards, you're worrying about your IEPs, you're making sure your curriculums are meeting your IEPs. When you get into the classroom, sometimes the organic nature of the classroom takes you in different spaces. And sometimes I think about my little lesson template I've typed out, and I've got my success criteria, and I have my learning targets, and I have my assessment pieces, but then I see the lesson change, and then I go back and say, now I got to go back. I want to work back. I don't want to work backwards, but I want to be responsive and go back to those documents and change them up and switch some success criteria. Tom, you talk about this all the time with assessment. Like, when I get assessment, I get that data. There's certain data that I'm predicting that's going to guide, but then there's other times that data takes me other places, and then do I want to pivot? And I do want to pivot. Actually, I want to twirl. I want to drop vernacular pivot. But then I also want to make sure that the structural changes that I had in place, I go back and I change those things around. So sometimes I find I teach very organically despite having a template or a plan. And then I make sure I'm going back and altering all these things so that conversations we have in the moment and jot notes on the whiteboard, etc., I go back and change all those foundational pieces so that when students say, reference a document that I posted 2 weeks ago, I'm sure that it's still up to date and current with how the class manifested over the 2 weeks, the changing of activities, the changing of what we want to do. And ultimately, a lot of those changes come from students' growth or students, their creativity. They've taken an assignment or a task and put it somewhere better than I could have ever envisioned, which is always the greatest part of teaching. But then I want to go back and make those foundational changes to my lesson plans and my documents so that it's accessible for students, but it's also documented for myself, because in the moment, we always think, oh, I'll remember this in 2 weeks. You're not going to remember it in 2 weeks. So you've got to go back. And as much as you do a lot of front end planning, I always find the little things that, make me think about and teach, oh, I got to go back and switch this. I got to go back and switch that. I got to go back and switch this. That maybe isn't totally important in the moment, but I know it's responsive teaching to go back and alter some of these things that manifest in the classroom. So it's probably pretty trivial. It's probably not a real sexy teacher answer, but it's, these are the things that they think they weigh you down a little bit, because they're not the things you invest your energies in the immediacy. You give so much energy in the classroom, the vibrancy, the organic twirls and stuff like that, that you also want to make sure you have your structures and your foundations in place and not just relying on the heat of the moment or the passion of the moment. You want to make sure those go back into sort of your planning and your foundational pieces so that they're there for you to access and for students to access later. That is what probably weighs me down at night, making sure I'm keeping up with all the twists and twirls that happen during the day.
Yeah. Okay, last question as we finish up today is about success, and it's a simple question. If a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success, personally, professionally, however you want to take this, how would you answer them?
One, I'd probably say, excuse me, why are you stopping me in the middle of the street? This is Toronto, Tom. This is Toronto. All tongue in cheek, all tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Success, I know what the answer should be. I find personal growth in myself. And that's what we want it to be. But, sometimes success is some of those talking points we've already talked about, is that the validation from people around you, the handshake, the congratulations. Sometimes those are moments of success. So I want to just say the success is, say, knowing Pav and I put out a great podcast episode, and when we're done recording and Pav's done editing, because she does the editing, that's not my wheelhouse, we go back and say, yeah, we're really proud of this. We feel good about this. And you feel so good that you say you stop looking at your podcast numbers. You start worried about downloads because you're just so proud of the content. And other times, you record an episode and you're like, what did you think about that? How did you feel about that? Should we edit this out? Is it worth editing that? And then you look at your numbers. Are people not going to listen because maybe the content doesn't hit? And so if I go the podcasting journey as sort of like the snapshot, and maybe it's a symbolic reflection of everything, Pav and I would say our success is when we record an episode that we feel really good about, that we don't bother to check numbers and see how it's doing on social media. We just feel really good about the content and the conversation and our talking points.
Yeah.
And we think that manifests beyond podcasts. So that'll be my definition of success with a podcast episode, and that's just a reflection of the greater scheme of things.
Yeah, it is definitely self-actualized as a podcaster to not look at your download numbers. That's for sure. Listeners, you can find Chey almost everywhere. You'll find Chey on Twitter, both at Mr. C. Cheney, all lowercase, or at Staff Podcast. Even though the name has changed, the Twitter handle is still the same. You'll find on Instagram, it's at Chey and Pav. Facebook and LinkedIn, the Staff Room Podcast, the website, www.cheyandpav.com. Chey, it was great to have you here. Certainly, I've appreciated getting to know you over the last year or so. Loved having you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for doing this.
Tom, thank you. Thank you for the invite. And now I only need 5 additional invites to try to catch up to Pav. So we'll have this conversation in a few seconds. I'm playing catch up, but I'm fine playing catch up. The 77 Yankees, they were down 5 games in August, so I can still do this.
Well, anything I can do to help facilitate that for you, Chey, we'll get you caught up to Pav in no time. Anyway, thanks again, man. I really appreciate it.